And we've been working with BYP coming up to 2 years now. One of the things that we really wanted to explore was how do different groups of different demographics experience and perform on assessments. Now, I've been working for SHL for about 3 years, but before I worked for them, I had never heard of SHL before, although I'd probably taken a number of their assessments as I've had to apply for different roles throughout my career. Whenever I'm talking to people, and in particular at the BYP conference a couple of years ago, I was trying to explain what it is that SHL actually does. And I would always ask people, have you ever had to take an online test as part of applying for a job? And the immediate reaction I would get would be oh, yes, oh God, I hate those things. And then I would have to say, well, I'm really sorry. That's what SHL does. And so whilst that type of assessment may never be a fully enjoyable experience, kind of similar to job interviews, what we want to do is make sure that it is an inclusive experience. And we're very aware that our assessments are part of a broader ecosystem that might decide who is successful for a role. Even internally, once people have got into organisations, they can play a part in deciding who goes on career development programmes, who's selected as talent for an organisation. So what we are really proud of is that SHL assessments in particular are really grounded in science. And we work really hard to make sure that we are removing as much bias and subjectivity from those decision-making processes. Now, as you've probably guessed from what I've said so far, I knew very little about the ins and outs of psychometric assessments before I started working for SHL. I'm actually joined by two incredible colleagues today, Darren and Kareem, who actually helped design and build these assessments. So we've got a great session lined up for you today. They are the scientists. Ask them all the tricky questions, please. Anything nice you can ask me, but all the difficult questions, please direct those to Darren and Kareem. But they're going to just take us through a little bit around the history of psychometric assessments, the different types of assessment you might come across, and most importantly, the top tips to help you prepare. One of the things we've been doing in conjunction with BYP is what we call our Black Heritage Research Programme. And some of you on the call may have even been participants in that programme. So they're also going to share as we go along some of the findings from that and how you can use that insight to really help you prepare for the next time that you are faced with one of these psychometric assessments. So I will stop talking now and I will leave you in the very capable hands of Darren and Kareem for the next section.
Awesome. Thank you, Lucy, so much. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We'll be focusing today on how we can best prepare you for taking psychometric assessments. And we want the session to be as interactive as possible while also giving you as many good tips as we can. My name is Kareem. I'm a senior research scientist. I work on our AI-based assessments, and I'm pleased to be joined here by Darren, who's our principal research scientist. Darren, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
I am a principal research scientist. I've been with SHL for 19 years now. I work with our cognitive ability assessments, but I work on a lot of our other assessments too over the years. Looking forward to presenting.
Awesome. Thank you, Darren. Just to give you a quick overview of our program that we've been working on, which the Black Heritage Research Program falls under. Our inclusive assessment research program aims to ensure that all candidates can perform at their best, regardless of age, race, or gender. We also look into how we can remove barriers for deaf candidates and those with visual or physical impairments, along with understanding the needs of neurodiverse talent. And this program is one of the multiple streams of work that we engage in. And a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll be looking at what are psychometric tests, why are they used, what are the different types of psychometric tests that you will be expecting to see, how you can prepare for psychometric tests, and what are the best tips for completing those psychometric tests. So with that, I'd like us to start with our first poll, which is what part of psychometric testing do you find most intimidating? Please select one of those options. Is it time pressure, not knowing what to expect? Is it fear of failure, lack of feedback, the bias or lack of fairness, or the mismatch with self-perception? Give it just a minute so that we can get a couple of responses there. Awesome. I can see a lot of responses coming in, and it seems like time pressure part seems to be the leading cause of things that you are that you find most intimidating. So that's good to know, because that's one of the things we'll be talking about in today's presentation, is how do you prepare most properly for those kind of assessments, and how do you take time into account? So it will be one of the things that we discuss. Cool. I'll hand it over now to Darren, who can start telling us more about psychometric tests and their history.
Great. So the reason the psychometric tests exist is because they're scientifically designed to measure specific traits. Now, there's lots of different types of psychometric tests. They're not specific to using in like pre-employment, like psychometrics are used in education, like the test that you probably took in school to assess things like that. They're used in clinical psychology to measure like depression and anxiety. So we, as Kareem and I, are focused on measuring the traits specific to predicting job performance. But we're part of sort of like a broader umbrella of scientists. So the tests, we have a lot of scientific rigor behind them, and they're designed that the purpose of the tests are so that they could be more fair for everybody involved. Now, you might have come across psychometric tests, and they can be challenging, and some of them do make you think. But one thing that we get a lot is that people think that we're trying to trick you. Psychometric assessments are not designed to trick you or confuse you. I can't say that you won't come across some assessments like that, but if you are applying to an organization that uses tricky assessments, that's probably not an organization you want to work for, because what we want to do is accurately measure your knowledge, skills, and abilities. Now, like I said, Kareem and I are psychometricians, or as my best friend likes to say, psychomagicians. We're trained professionals with graduate training. We have backgrounds in psychological traits and in statistics, measurement, all those sorts of things. And the whole goal for us is to design tests that are valid, reliable, and fair. Next slide. So if you've come across psychometric assessments in the past, they've changed a lot in the last 20 years. Back in the day, they used to all be paper pencil, like you would have to go in, someone would sit in a room and complete these assessments. They moved online about 20 years ago. Now, in the past, you might just see strongly agree to strongly disagree to strongly agree. Now, we've moved away from this type of question, because if you take a look at that, you might see some of the problems. For example, if you're applying for a job and it's asking you if you like to stay late to get all your tasks done, naturally your tendency is going to say that you want to agree to that, because you want to look to the employer like you're willing to work hard to get the job. So we've taken a lot of lessons learned from the last 20 years and evolved the way that assessments look and feel, so that we can get more accurate measurement and to make them more engaging. I'm going to take a look. Next slide. You can go to the next one, Kareem. All right. So this is more like what you're going to probably see from current psychometric assessments. So we've moved away from those multiple choice questions that go from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and instead use what we call forced choice, where you have to select one option of multiple. And then we also have cognitive ability assessments that, rather than just selecting the best option out of 4 or 5 options, sometimes you have to actually input your response or manipulate, say, a pie chart or a bar chart, something like that. So you're going to see a lot more innovation. But the goal here is we want to have a better candidate experience, but we also can get a lot more information in less time by using these more advanced types of assessments. Next slide. So why do we use psychometric assessments? Well, the very last thing that we want to rely on for hiring is just a hiring manager's gut instinct. There's a lot of bias in that. So even though there's interviews and there's a lot of structure that can be added to the interview process, psychometric assessments are the most fair way to assess different traits. We're designed because we don't, I mean, the only information that we get about you is how you respond to the questions, and those questions have been validated to prove that they're related to job performance. So they're fairer than interviews, and it helps us identify which candidates have the knowledge, skills, and abilities for the job. So the types of assessment that you take are going to be typically tailored to the job that you're applying for. So it's looking at what's most important for job success in that particular role. And so those are the assessments that are typically used to measure that. And so we can determine from the outset who's best suited for those jobs. And it also is a bit of fit. So, sometimes you have a lot of unique competencies and contributions to a particular organization, but that might not necessarily fit that particular role or that particular organization. So, the psychometric assessment is a bit of fit for both you and for the organization. So next slide, sorry. So the question is, if you fail an assessment, does it mean you're a bad candidate? Absolutely not. There are lots of reasons that, if you've completed a psychometric assessment and you don't get the role, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're, a poor candidate. It typically means that, you might not be a good fit for that particular role. Your knowledge, skills, abilities, values, work preferences, all those types of things might be a better fit for a similar role in a different organization or a different role within that same organization. So maybe you're more oriented towards customer service versus sales, for example. So our psychometric assessments are a good way to try and assess that.
Awesome. Thanks, Darren. So now that we have an idea of what psychometric tests are, you probably have seen different types of those tests. So it might be useful for us to go through those different types and just get an idea of what these different types of psychometric assessments are. So broadly speaking, we'll be talking about 4 main types of psychometric assessments. Ones which are related to personality or your behavior. One's related about your cognitive ability. One is about how you would respond to situations and how you would judge how to perform in those situations, and others that look at simulations and measuring particular skills. We'll start with looking at personality or behavioral assessments. And personality is a combination of the different characteristics or qualities that make you distinctive from other people. And the way in which we can look at personality and measure it is by asking you questions about whether a statement aligns with you or not, or describes you properly. It could be on a scale where you're looking at this particular statement and seeing how well this statement describes you, but it could also be presented in a way that we call forced choice. So if we look at the animation here, a candidate is being asked given 3 statements, and it's asked to select the one that describes them the best. And then once they select that option disappears, and then you have two other statements where you need to describe which one of those describes you best. So this is another way of looking at how we can measure your personality. Instead of just asking you whether you agree or disagree with a statement, you can also be looking at different statements and think about which one describes you the most. Now, related to personality assessments is also behavioral assessments. And the main difference between them is that when we talk about personality assessments, we're asking you what you prefer to do. But in behavioral assessments, we usually talk about what you actually do. The other type of assessments that we also often see used by companies are cognitive ability assessments. Those kind of puzzles, they try to ask you to solve a problem, and this could be related to reading comprehension, math skills, spatial ability, and those are usually referred to as game-based assessments. They would incorporate stuff like trophies, leaderboards. So they are designed to actually make it look like you're actually solving a puzzle or participating in a game. But just because they look like one doesn't mean that you shouldn't be taking things seriously. They are designed to measure your mental ability, and then look into particular types of cognitive reasoning that you might have. So for example here, in this question, where we're trying to find in which working days all people are available, while also looking at the conditions we have, you're trying to make use of different information that you have. You're trying to make eliminations, make some deductions. So it is taking into account multiple things, even though it is presented to be in sort of a graphical interface that looks very game friendly. The other kinds of assessments that we also think about are situational judgment assessments. So those are usually types of assessments where you're presented with a situation and you're asked about what would you do in that situation. And sometimes you'd be selecting one of multiple choices. Other times you would be asked which of these actions would be the best thing to do. Another also type of assessment that is related to situational judgment tests are experiences, or what we call biodata. And those ask you to compare yourself to others in your current or previous job. For example, the way that those questions would be asked would be, if we were to ask your current supervisor how quickly you would work compared to your coworkers, they would say, and then the options would be, I would work in the same pace, I would work much quicker than others, or less. So those are kind of questions where you're asked not only about your experiences, but also about how you would compare to other people. And the last kind of assessment type that I'll be talking about is the more kind of up to date and the more recent kind of assessments. They are called simulations. And simulations, they are typically designed to check what you might do actually on a job. So they are very realistic. They would give you examples of situations and tasks that you will probably be doing once you're hired for a job, and they would ask you to do it. So an example of what we see here on the screen is a coding assessment where you're required to produce some code in an actual virtual environment. So we've talked a lot about the different kind of assessments and the history of them, but I'm assuming that most of you are interested to know about, okay, how can I prepare for the assessments? How can I set myself up for success? And this is what we'll be trying to talk about throughout the rest of the presentation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Darren so that we can start thinking about those tips for success.
So if you're applying for a job and you know that if you're informed that you're going to be taking a psychometric assessment, if you can, try and find out which tests you're going to be taking, like the different types that we've discussed so far. And sometimes, if possible, even the test vendor, because SHL has a lot of materials and information available about our different assessments, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But some of our other competitors that do psychometric assessment as well have similar resources available. But even if you don't have the exact information about the test that you're going to be taking, just going to our site will probably help a lot. And also, you can just do some internet searches for psychometric test practice, because any opportunity that you have to practice taking assessments, becoming more familiar with the content, the layout, how to respond, that types of thing is going to help you in the long run. So, try and practice as much as possible, especially when it comes to cognitive ability. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that's so important. But when you do complete practice tests, if you come across a question type that you don't know how to answer, especially if it's like a cognitive ability type and it's some sort of reasoning question you don't understand how you're supposed to receive, try and get some help. If you know somebody that does particularly well at this type of assessment, or if there is a trusted coach, teacher, advisor, professor, etc., that you've worked with in the past that can help you work through these things, it'll help you in the long run. We have another poll. So for this one, this is just an example. We just sort of want to demonstrate something here. So which of the following statements describes you best? I am highly dependable and always follow through on commitments. I'm a quick learner and adapt easily to new situations. I am very creative and enjoy coming up with new ideas. So I'll just give you all a minute to indicate which of those you think describes you best, and then we'll talk about that. All right, this is good. This pretty much demonstrates what I was going to talk about here. And you can see that, we have one option that's a little bit more favorable than the other, but it's pretty evenly mixed between the three different response options. So why is that so important? Let's go on to the next slide. A lot of different personality tests and behavioral tests are what we call forced choice. So Kareem talked about that already. So you have to select one of 3 or 4 options that best describes you, and you can't select the other option. So you have to pick something that's most like you. Now, kind of skip to the middle option. What you want to do here is be honest, because job fit is just as important for you as it is for the employer. So if you indicate a response because you're trying to anticipate what you think the employer wants, you could end up getting a role that you're not happy with, that you can't perform well in, because it's just not suited to your skills, preferences, and abilities. So always be honest, and try and be consistent in your responses. So if one of those options jumps out at you, that's the one that you should select. And it's usually best to go with your first response. Don't overthink it, because like I was saying, if you're trying to anticipate what you think an employer is looking for, you might just end up with it might end up hurting you in the end. One last thing about personality and behavioral items is that you should really read them carefully. A lot of times, those questions can be negatively worded. So it's asking you what you don't do or you are least likely to do. Just make sure that you read those carefully so that you don't respond in the opposite direction that you intend to. All right, so now we're going to go on to cognitive. We have another poll. So what is your experience with practice tests? You've done several and you find them helpful. You've tried a few, but you don't do them regularly. You've heard of them, but you've never tried one. You didn't know practice tests were available, or you don't see the value in doing practice tests. Okay, great. Well, it looks like there is some experience with practice tests. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the next bit here. So for cognitive ability tests, the most important thing that you can do is practice. I mentioned there a couple times, practice, practice, practice. We have done a lot of research over the past few years looking at the effects of practice tests and scores. So even if you just take some sample questions at the beginning of a test, your score can be boosted up to 60%. So it's always important to take the practice test. You become more familiar with the content, and you can become more comfortable with the different types of assessments available. It's always best to read the instructions. Like I was showing you earlier, a lot of newer tests aren't just multiple choice. They use innovative response formats. So it's best to read the instructions so that you understand what you're supposed to do. Now, I know instructions aren't fun. A lot of people like to skip instructions or skim instructions. But if you want to set yourself up for success, it's best to really understand what you're supposed to do. If anything is unclear, or if there's something in the instructions that's confusing that you think might impact your performance, there's usually a technical support line available somewhere in the instructions that will, that you can call to get some additional support. Now, most cognitive ability tests are timed. There are some assessments that aren't timed, but most are. Some are actually speeded, where the whole goal is for you to get through as many questions as possible in a really limited amount of time. In either scenario, it's best not to spend too long on one question. If you're not sure of an answer, it's typically better to just guess and move on rather than spending a lot of your time, because most assessments will penalize you more for not getting through an entire test than for getting a question early on wrong. So it's better to just make an educated guess and move on to other content where you might have a higher chance of getting the question correct than spending all of your time on a single question. Some of the cognitive ability tests that are out there, I would say it's about 50-50 these days, are computer adaptive. So computer adaptive means that everybody gets different questions. So no two people get the same set of questions. You start out with a question of sort of medium difficulty, and depending on how you respond, the questions will get either easier or more difficult. So if you're getting the questions right, the questions will get harder. If you get questions wrong, the questions will start getting easier. And as you can see in the graph at the bottom, the whole goal is for us to sort of hone in on your score. So the difference in the difficulty of the questions will sort of get smaller and smaller as it goes. Now, if you know that a test is computer adaptive, there's this tendency to try and judge how well you're doing based on how difficult you think a question is. So if you get a question that you think is really easy, you might think that you're not doing well. Or if you get a question that's really hard, you might think that you're doing well. It's best to just approach each question and just do your best as you go, because what you think is an easy question might actually be difficult for like the general audience. Just trying to adjust each question as you go. Now, the goal of a computer adaptive test is to get to a point. Now, this might seem counterintuitive, but what the goal of computer adaptive testing is to get to a level of difficulty where you have about a 50% chance of getting the question correct. Because of that, questions typically seem harder for everybody. So from the general sort of candidate experience when completing computer adaptive tests is that the questions are difficult. So on average, people find them challenging. So just keep that in mind, because we don't want people to get discouraged about how well they're performing because all of the questions seem difficult. That's going to be the candidate experience for everybody. All right. And one last thing about cognitive ability tests, but this does apply to pretty much all of the assessments. If you are neurodiverse or have a disability that requires some sort of accommodation, It is your responsibility to ask the test vendor or the hiring company for an accommodation. So if that's extended time, assistance with like visual interfaces, anything like that, it's up to you to notify the company so that you can get that accommodation. You will always be granted that accommodation. Now there is sort of, I guess, a bit of anxiety perhaps for some people to disclose if they have a need for an accommodation, because they feel that that might negatively impact how they're perceived by the hiring organization. If that's the case, I would argue that that's probably not a company that you want to work for, if that's how they're going to behave. But most organizations are honest and want the best and most fair experience for all of their candidates. I can't speak for all organizations, but this is what most of our clients choose to do, and they're great and use all of our assessments accurately and fairly.
Reiterate what Darren was saying about accommodations. You might feel anxious about asking for accommodations, but we do find that clients most of the time tell us that they are unaware that candidates would like those accommodations, and they would be more than happy to do them, but they're just not aware of them. So it's very important to advocate for yourself there and ask for accommodations when you need them. I'll talk a little bit more about some tips and tricks when thinking about situational judgment and biodata tests. So those usually ask about interactions. They're most likely going to be interacting with other people. So one of the best tips I've heard about how you would deal with those kind of questions is, imagine if you were on the other side, how you would like to be treated. And that's usually the best response. And when those questions are usually asked, we're looking for things around responsibility, integrity, customer service, empathy. There are specific traits that the company would be looking for in those kind of questions. So do think about those traits and think about the options that would be exemplifying them. And read carefully the questions that you get. Situational judgment test questions, they're usually very nuanced, and they have a lot of different meaning of them. And every word that's used in them, it's used for a particular purpose. So not necessarily overthinking about what the actual question is asking you, but be sure that you get an idea of all the different things that they're being asked in a question. And when it comes to biodata questions, be honest when you're answering those questions, particularly because they require you to compare with others. And it might be sometimes very difficult that you kind of say that you are really good at something because you don't want to brag about it. But you don't need to be very modest. Be as accurate as you can in how you think the actual response should be. And then when it comes to simulations, like coding assessments, ask the employer if there's any practice tests that are available. Sometimes, even if there isn't, if you have an idea of what you're going to actually be assessed about, you might find tutorials online. They might not be exactly the same, but they might be similar to what you're actually working on. And do not rush when working with them, particularly when it comes to coding assessment. Most people think, okay, I need to solve this as fast as possible and then get everything right. But it's sometimes more about how you're actually experimenting with things and how you're actually trying different solutions in order to come up with the right answer. And remember that in most simulations, every interaction that you make with the content is usually recorded. So this also gives you an idea that they might be looking not just for you about getting the right answer, but also in how you actually make use of the different available stimuli that you have on the screen. And to be fair, simulations are probably the hardest to prepare for, particularly because there's so much variability in them. So coding assessments, even just in that, there's so many different ways that a coding simulation might happen. But there's also different types of simulations that are not just like coding related. They could be language related. They could be about role playing with someone. So the best advice there is to be confident about your abilities and prep in any way that you think might be helpful by looking things online and looking at other tutorials. And the last thing we'll do is just give you a couple of tips that would be applicable to almost any type of assessments that you're working on. When you know that you do have to complete assessments as part of your application, try to find a quiet place that you will likely be uninterrupted so that you can focus while taking those assessments. And try to use the device that you're most comfortable with. So some people might prefer using a laptop or a desktop in comparison to using a mobile, but others might actually find it easier to actually complete assessments on their mobile device. If you do that, and most assessments nowadays are actually compatible with using a mobile device, but make sure that you're actually allowed to use your mobile, or that also that the assessment is actually compatible with using a mobile instead of just being accessible via a desktop or a computer. If you're using your phone, make sure to turn off all notifications. One, so that you are not distracted, and two, so that you're not flagged as you're trying to cheat or doing something that you're not actually doing. In many assessments, there is an option to exit and then resume an assessment. So in case you get interrupted while taking the assessments, you might have that opportunity to say, okay, I need to pause right now, and I'll come back again once I'm in a better environment to complete those assessments. And this is particularly important for time tests, because if you get interrupted and you don't know that the assessment is being timed, you might actually lose all the time that you have to answer an assessment. If you're taking a cognitive ability assessment, particularly those that are like numerical reasoning tests, it might be helpful to have a notepad, a writing utensil to just jot down some ideas, or maybe a calculator to be doing practice tests. To be doing the calculations that you need to do. And you might have seen that I already said practice tests, but I guess this is how important it is. It's very important to take practice tests as much as you can in advance. And this is what I would like us to end our presentation on, which is, I know it's already been shared in the chat, but we have a website which is free for everyone to use, and it has a lot of practice content on it. It's called SHL Direct. You can either go to this website or just Google SHL Direct, and it will probably be the first result that you get out there. If you go there and press on take practice tests, you'll get a bunch of different tests that you can practice for, some of which will actually give you a report about how you actually performed. But it will generally be a good idea for you to get input on how the questions would look like. And we would encourage you to use that opportunity, even if you know that your assessment is not going to be an assessment that is developed by SHL. It most likely will be something that we have something similar to. So generally speaking, tests are usually do follow a common theme and a common way of asking questions. So you will find some benefit, even if it's not an SHL developed test. And I think with that, we'll be ending the presentation and handing it back over to you, Lucy, so that we can start Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kareem, and thank you, Darren. I've heard you do that presentation a few times now, and I still learn something every time I listen to it. So it's been really helpful. You actually already answered a couple of questions that I've seen come through in the chat. But we did have one early on around passing thresholds, which I know is going to be a tricky answer. But the question is, what are the passing thresholds to get to the next stage of a company's recruitment? Darren, do you mind giving us your thoughts on that one?
That is a tough question, because we provide assessments to our client organizations, and we offer best practice recommendations for them on the different types of assessments, how to use them. However, clients sometimes make their own choices on how to alter that. So typically our standard recommendation is to use the 30th percentile cut score, meaning that 70% of people make it past that sifting stage and move on to further recruitment, whether that's interviews, resume reviews, job tests, things like that. But some organizations, move their cut score 40, 50. I've seen it as high as 90. So it kind of depends on the organization, how competitive the role is, things like that. So it's a hard answer, but generally our recommendation is the 30th percentile, and I would say at least half of the organizations we work with, you go with that recommendation.
Brilliant, thank you. And let me just follow that up with a kind of similar question, which is, when clients are making those decisions around what the cut score is going to be, how do they decide what score you need to move on to the next round? Is it the same for everyone? I guess, why do we as SHL advise on that 30th percentile? What's the thinking behind that?
So there's a lot of research that went behind it. So it's sort of like a convergence of multiple factors, because one, we want our tests to be as fair as possible. Two, we want our client organizations to get a return on investment. They pay for our tests, and so they want to make sure that they are hiring the best people. And also, you know, as reliable as our tests are, they're not perfect measurements. So there is a bit of error there. So we want to make sure that, you know, the best people are making it past, and we're not excluding, you know, people that may excel at certain other parts of the job that we haven't measured yet. So for example, we might be using only a cognitive ability assessment as the initial sift, but we don't know anything about your reliability, ability to show up to work on time, how well you work with coworkers, your customer service focus, that sort of thing. If we haven't measured that yet, we don't want to exclude you like right out of the gate.
Brilliant, thank you. Kareem, I've got a question for you here, which is a really interesting one, and I know one of your subject matter areas, and that is, how much of the test grading is done by AI or software, and can that mess with fairness?
That's a very good question. It depends on the type of the assessment that you're working on. A lot of the assessments that we work on, we do have some sort of standard way of grading those assessments, so they're not scored by AI. But for assessments that are scored by AI, it's very important that we get an idea on how is AI being used to score an assessment. We generally wouldn't recommend using AI to make a decision. It would just kind of to get you an idea of how you're performing. And in those situations, we would be training our AIs. For example, if we have an assessment that we know an AI is going to be used to score it, we would be making sure that the AI that we train will be trained on a very diverse set of data, so that it can show us what would actual real candidate data look like. And we do a lot of measurements in place and a lot of analysis to make sure that it's not discriminating or disadvantaging one particular group of people in comparison to the others. So we do have a lot of situations where we make sure that the AI is also judging in a way that human subject matter expert, if they were to grade your assessment, they would also be arriving to similar responses. So we do look at a couple of things. One is looking at how reliable that measurement is that's coming from the AI. Does it replicate what a human subject matter expert would look like? And the second is, does it actually amplify, or does it actually try to get rid of some of the biases that we can see if we are using an AI in comparison to a human expert?
Really interesting, thank you. And I guess on the topic of AI, what do organizations, and I guess specifically SHL, have in place to make sure that people aren't cheating some of these assessments by like using AI to take the assessment for them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And yeah, I can start with it and then I'll hand it over to you, because I know we've been doing a lot of research on that. So I think one of the things that's coming now as something that people are talking more about is that, well, AI might be able to solve some of those questions, so why don't we use AI in order to do that? So there's a couple of things that you need to take into account when trying to use AI. One is that it doesn't work on all types of questions. Second is, usually if you are using, if the company is administering your test, they're probably proctoring you as well. So there'll probably be signals that show that you are using an AI in order to take the assessment for you. And you probably don't want to jeopardize your chance there of actually moving on to the second stage by doing that. And I think this is where Darren can give more information. From what we've been seeing so far, trying to cheat a test with AI is probably too time consuming that it would just not be feasible to actually complete assessments, especially when you're doing a timed assessment. So those are a couple of things that I would think about. But with that being said, the fact that you're able to use AI is actually a skill that we know is becoming more and more important. So there are actually more assessments that are being developed, and we are kind of thinking about that, are looking at how good would you be at using AI in order to complete tasks, because we know that AI is here to stay. It's not something that's going to disappear anytime soon. So this is also something to kind of think about. If you're good at AI, that's good, and it's a really good skill to have in this day and age, but also make sure that you're using it responsibly.
Darren, anything you want to add to Kareem's answer?
That pretty much covers it. But yeah, we spend a lot of time testing our content using the different Gen AI tools just to see, like, how robust they are. And like Kareem said, like, one, we have proctoring features that measure whether or not people are using it, and two, it gets the questions wrong a lot. In some cases, it takes longer to use Gen AI than just to answer it yourself. And when it comes to non-cognitive content, it has no idea how to respond. So especially when it comes to those forced choice type questions. So it's best to just respond as you.
Cool. Thank you. So next couple of questions. Your message around practice has definitely landed, because we have quite a few questions on that topic. The first one's quite an interesting one. So somebody's saying they have an assessment with Thrive. There are no practice questions for them online. I don't know what to expect. How do I handle such a situation? Thoughts on that one?
So I'm not familiar with like every company's tests and whatnot. I try to keep up on it, obviously. But typically you can get some screen grabs of the types of assessments that a vendor offers. So you can see, like, is it going to be a cognitive test? Is it going to be a personality test? Something like that. Usually, I mean, we try and be as unique as possible in the way that we measure cognitive ability to set ourselves away from our competitors, but we're all kind of measuring the same thing. And if you practice any cognitive assessment, you're generally going to start doing well at the others. The other thing is, most vendors usually have some sort of practice test built into the assessment. All of our assessments, we have SHL Direct, which is like a separate thing, but any one of our cognitive tests has 2, 3, 4, 5 practice questions built into it that are optional, but like 70% of people actually go through those. And it gives you tips that tells you where to respond. Like, if you can't figure out the question, it'll give you some hints. Those are the types of things that you should look for. And if you get into the assessment and you don't see a practice test available, you're not typically required to like complete that test right then and there. You can sometimes exit and come back to it. So that might be an option there. Once you get a better idea of what you're going to be asked to do, you can then go to SHL Direct and see if you can find the best match.
Thank you. Another really interesting question on the topic of practice is, do you have practice test apps to practice on smartphones or tablets? And I guess I'll broaden that question a little bit, because I know lots of these tests are mobile optimized these days. But if you want to set yourself up for success, would you say do it on a mobile or do it on a laptop or desktop?
I think it's a matter of like individual preference. I think for me, I've always preferred doing those kind of assessments on a computer instead of using a mobile device. But you bring up like an interesting thing, which is if you think that you would be more comfortable doing the assessment on a mobile, and you know that the assessment you're going to take is going to be available on taking it on a mobile, then do your practice while using a mobile. Try to replicate the environment that you're going to be taking your assessment in as much as possible. So maybe practice in the same room that you think you're going to be taking the assessment in, because it just makes you more ready for that. And in terms of apps, there's like so many of them, but like not are all good quality, because all of them just are like puzzles, but they don't necessarily actually represent what you're going to be taking. I would say like with SHL Direct, for example, the website we've shared, I think most of them you can take them on an actual mobile, so you can try to replicate that experience there.
Thank you. And I guess I'm going to do one last question on practice, because there were quite a few of them. So this one is, how do you know which practice resources actually match the real test a company gives? And Darren, you kind of touched on this earlier about kind of maybe asking the company who their providers are. Anything else, any other tips that kind of people could do to make sure they're practicing the right thing?
I mean, if you know what sort of role that you're applying for, sometimes, if this is assuming that you get absolutely no feedback from the organization you're applying to or get any additional information. You can look at the role that you're applying to, and you can just Google what types of psychometric assessments, or ask ChatGPT. ChatGPT will give you a very good answer. What types of psychometric assessments would typically be used for, and then you just enter the job title. It'll probably give you like 3 or 4 tests. If you're applying for an accounting job, a numerical reasoning test is probably going to show up. So you might want to look at our numerical reasoning tests. But if you're applying for, I don't know, some other type of role that doesn't really use numbers all that much, you might be using like a deductive test or a verbal test or something like that. So I would say, just if you get absolutely nothing else, just try either Googling or ChatGPTing just that simple question, and you'll probably get a pretty decent response.
Yeah, and most of the times you will usually get an automated email saying you've been invited to take assessments. So it probably will tell you what the actual assessments are, so then you can go Google them. But if not, I think Darren already mentioned this, you can, once you land on that page and register to take the assessments, you'll probably get an idea of like these are like the title of the assessments. So you can exit, do the practice that you want, and then come and take it at another time.
Thank you. This is just moving on from the topic of practice for a little bit. This is a really interesting question. So, do test scores matter more than your resume or how well you do in an interview?
That, again, is sort of organizational dependent and where they place testing. So the typical scenario is you do the testing first, and then sort of they do like a sifting process, and then you move on to the next process, where which is usually the interview. And the interview questions are typically oriented around the assessments that you already took. So if the the job requires deductive reasoning, customer service orientation, and reliability, you're going to get, and those are the tests that we offer, and then you're probably going to get interview questions about those topics. So if you've done your practice and prepared, you probably have answers already for those interview questions. As far as resume goes, that's often kind of up to recruiters, HR folks. So it's hard to say that if you've been invited to take the assessment, someone has probably already looked at your resume.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say like after the assessment, it's I think about preparing for interviews.
Yeah. What I'm getting from you is they're all important.
Well, I mean, essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
But like I said, the order that things happen can vary from client to client. Some people don't do their testing until the very end, like just as like a final check.
Yeah, true. This is I think one that lots of people will resonate with, and it's some of these tests are very fast. Any tips for staying calm and doing well under time pressure?
I think practicing usually
I
is
knew you were
helpful
going to say
for me.
practice.
I think the more you're familiar with something, the more likely you'll be calmer when you actually take the test because you've already seen it before. So, but I think Darren mentioned a couple of things about when taking time tests. If you think that kind of be wise with the time that you're spending. If you're spending some time on a question and you think that you're not going to get towards an answer anytime soon, it might be better to actually skip that question and go to the next question rather than wasting all your time, all your time on it. So those are a couple of things that I usually do. Either kind of try to see what these questions might look like so I'm familiar with them. That makes me feel less anxious when I have to take them, or kind of know which ones I should be targeting and which ones I can come back to later if I can.
Yeah, I think it's also really important to remember the point that you shared with us earlier around some of these tests are designed to get harder if you're doing well. So it might make you feel like, oh, it's taking me longer to answer these questions because they're starting to get harder, and not getting disheartened because actually it's getting harder because you are doing well on the easier questions. And that's something I never knew about psychometrics until I started working at SHL and kind of heard some of these things. So really important to remember that and not panic. But as you said, just practice, get familiar with it. That will help you to stay calm. I think we've got time for one last question, and it is another question about
I did have one
practicing.
other comment before we
Sure.
moved on. Most most organizations use multiple tests. So if you think that you flubbed one, it's not over. We don't do multiple hurdles, meaning we don't like cut at each test. We usually add all the tests together, and it's how well you do on, say, all 2, 3, 4 tests. So if you think you've just tanked one, don't stress about it and don't let that affect how you perform on the subsequent tests. Just like put it out of your mind and move on.
That's a really good tip. That is a really good tip. So last question, again on the topic of practicing, again, I think this is an interesting one. Should you keep practicing all the time, even if you don't have an assessment coming up, so that you're always ready? Or should you kind of have a deep dive practice period around the kind of recruitment process?
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat and I was kind of like, oh, very interesting. um, I think it depends on the person.
How much
So
do you enjoy doing these assessments?
yeah, do you
Really
actually
want
want
to,
to
yeah.
do you actually want to be doing those kind of assessments all the time? I would say for some of them, like personality assessments, like no matter how many times like you take them, there's no right answer, right? So it's just who you are and just answering questions about yourself. But with some stuff that are cognitive ability related, if you haven't done something that requires a particular math skill in a while, you might actually forget it in time. So it might be better to kind of like practice it a bit in advance or a bit more, allowing yourself more time to practice it. I think when I was applying for jobs, I was kind of like very concentrating during a particular time and kind of like taking those assessments just because I knew there were multiple jobs that I'm applying for. Many of them were asking me to take assessments. So it was helpful for me to kind of be doing that around the time that I was applying for jobs. So that's my experience, but I guess it will differ between people.
And if you're older like me, it's best you don't necessarily have to do cognitive ability practice test assessments. Just doing puzzles, word searches, crossword puzzles. That's the word I was looking for. On a daily basis, just because it sort of like, staves off the inevitable cognitive decline that we all experience. So it'll just keep you sharper generally. So you don't necessarily have to do like an SHL direct practice test, but just, any sort of like cognitively engaging activity will help you.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much. It's been such a great webinar. Just trying to say, I think Lucy might have dropped off, but it has been great so far. Kareem, we have a question. Someone wants you to please answer in the chat. We just want to start with that. Oh, hi, Lucy's here. I just wanted to close with that. It's again about practice tests. I guess a lot of people need help with that. So this person is basically asking, is it a good idea to have a stopwatch or timer or an alarm on each question?
Oh, that's a good one. I think it depends on if you know how many questions you have and how much time you have, then you might get an idea of how much you need to be spending per question. I haven't used that myself before. When I've been taking assessment, I would just get a sense while taking the question that I'm not getting anywhere, and I don't think I'm going to be able to solve it. So it might be better to just move on. But speaking about timers, some people find them really helpful, but some people also find them really like something that would make you anxious while taking the actual assessment and seeing the timer ticking down. So some of the times you have that option to hide the timer if you don't want to see it, but if it's actually there and it's helpful for you, then you can like look at it look at it occasionally.
All right, that's great. Did you want to add to that, Darren?
I was like, yeah, I used to teach test prep for the GRE, like way back before I started SHL. Our recommendation was if you have, say, 10 questions in 10 minutes, so that's 1 minute per question, you add 50% to that. And if you reach that for a particular question, then that's sort of your indication that you should probably just guess and move on. So for that, so that would be like 1.5 minutes, because that, like, the longer that you spend, the less time that you have for all subsequent questions.
Right. Okay, right. And I'm going to close on this note. This person has put this question twice in the chat box, and this is for you, Darren. So basically this person is asking, following earlier AI questions, how are the new systems fighting against AI cheats? And that's the last one, guys. That's the last question.
Okay. Well, like I was saying, we regularly take our tests using the new Gen AI tools just so that we can see how they perform. But we make enhancements to our content that makes it more difficult because we know what the strengths and weaknesses of Gen AI are. So we know what it can't do. And so we ask questions that take advantage of that. But like Kareem said, we also have proctoring features. So we know if you're not looking at the screen, we know if there's like a phone in the screen, we know if you're switching tabs on your computer. All of that stuff gets reported and sent on to the client. So if you get a super high score and they see all these weird behaviors, they're going to question your score.
Okay. All right, great. Did you want to speak to that as well, Kareem?
No, I think that covers it perfectly.
All right, that's great. And this is the perfect way to end the webinar. We have a comment. Thank you so much for this session. This has been very engaging and knowledgeable. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Kareem. If you would like to connect with SHL further after this webinar, please use the links in the chat box. We have the LinkedIn, we have the Instagram, and we also have BYP's job board. If you'd like to connect with SHL there as well, please use the links. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. Looking forward to the next event. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.